In the final hours of the Third Reich, beneath 20 feet of concrete and steel, a man stood watching as two corpses burned in a shallow crater. The thick black smoke rose into the shattered remains of the Reich Chancellery garden, while Soviet artillery pounded the ruins of Berlin. His name was Erich Kempka, and for nearly a decade he had been one of the most trusted men in Adolf Hitler's inner circle. What he witnessed that day would make him one of the most important witnesses to history's end. But could his testimony be trusted? And what became of the man who claimed he poured the gasoline that consumed the Führer's body? Erich Kempka was born on September 16, 1910, in Oberhausen, a gritty industrial city in western Germany. His father worked in the coal mines, and young Erich grew up in the hard economic reality of Weimar Germany. Like millions of young Germans in the 1920s, he watched his country struggle under the weight of the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation, and mass unemployment. The world he inherited was one of humiliation and scarcity. Kempka's path to Hitler's inner circle began not through political fanaticism, but through mechanical skill. As a teenager, he developed an obsession with automobiles and motorcycles. He trained as a mechanic and driver, acquiring expertise with the luxury vehicles that would later become his responsibility. In 1930, at just 20 years old, he joined the Nazi Party. He wasn't an early ideologue or a street fighter from the beer hall days. He was a skilled tradesman who saw opportunity in a growing political movement. His technical abilities caught the attention of the SS, and by 1932 he was working as a driver in the motor pool that served high-ranking Nazi officials. Germany was still a republic. Hitler was not yet in power. But the machinery of the movement was already forming, and Kempka was learning to navigate it. Everything changed on January 30th, 1933. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and the small circle of men around him suddenly controlled the levers of state power. The motor pool expanded, the security apparatus tightened, and Erich Kempka, now 22, found himself driving some of the most dangerous men in Europe. In 1934, Hitler's previous chief driver, a man named Julius Schreck, took notice of Kempka's reliability and discretion. Schreck had been Hitler's chauffeur since the early 1920s, one of the few men the Führer trusted completely. But Schreck was ill. He was dying of meningitis, and he needed a successor. He recommended Kempka. On January 16, 1936, Julius Schreck died. Within weeks, Erich Kempka became Hitler's personal driver. He was 25 years old. From that moment forward, his life would be spent within arm's reach of absolute power. The job was not ceremonial. Hitler traveled constantly, by car, by train, by plane. Kempka was responsible for every detail of the Führer's ground transportation. He oversaw a fleet of armor-plated Mercedes-Benz limousines, coordinated security routes, and ensured that Hitler's vehicles were maintained to perfection. He hired and supervised the other drivers. He decided who sat where during motorcades, and he was always present. Hitler valued loyalty above all else, and Kempka provided it without question. He didn't challenge, he didn't gossip, he didn't ask questions. In the paranoid world of the Nazi elite, where rivalries were deadly and trust was rare, Kempka became invisible in the way that servants do. He was there, but not there. Necessary, but unnoticed. This invisibility gave him access. He was present at the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat. He traveled to party rallies in Nuremberg. He drove Hitler to meetings with foreign dignitaries and military commanders. He witnessed private conversations. He saw who visited, who was favored, who fell from grace. And because he was the driver, no one thought to guard their words around him. Kempka's testimony after the war would provide historians with details about Hitler's routines, his preferences, his moods. Hitler, Kempka said, disliked small talk during drives. He would sit in silence for hours, staring out the window, or suddenly launch into monologues about architecture, history, or his plans for Germany's future. He was obsessed with speed, but also with control. He insisted that Kempka maintain a smooth ride, no sudden braking, no rough turns. The car had to glide. But Kempka also claimed that Hitler treated him with a strange, paternal warmth. He said Hitler remembered his birthday, that he gave him gifts, that he inquired about his family. Whether this was true or a post-war fabrication designed to humanize himself remains an open question. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began, Kempka held the rank of Obersturmbannführer in the SS, equivalent to a lieutenant colonel. He wasn't a combat officer, he never commanded troops in battle. But the rank reflected his status within the regime. He was part of the inner circle, a man who could be trusted with the Führer's life. As the war progressed, that life grew more isolated. Hitler spent less time in Berlin and more time at his military headquarters, the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, deep in the forests of East Prussia, the Berghof, high in the Bavarian Alps. And later, as the fronts collapsed, the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Kempka followed him to all of them. The work became more dangerous. Allied air raids turned German roads into killing zones. Partisan attacks threatened motorcades in occupied territories. Security protocols became suffocating. Kempka's job was no longer just to drive. It was to keep Hitler alive long enough to reach his destination. And then came July 20th, 1944. The bomb plot. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg walked into a military briefing at the Wolf's Lair, left a briefcase bomb under the conference table, and walked out. The explosion killed 4 men. Hitler survived with burst eardrums and shredded trousers. The regime's response was savage. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds were executed. Trust, already scarce, evaporated completely. Kempka was not involved in the plot. He was questioned, like everyone in Hitler's circle, but quickly cleared. His loyalty was unquestioned. In the months that followed, as the conspiracy trials ground on and the Eastern Front crumbled, Kempka's position only grew more essential. Hitler trusted almost no one, but he still trusted his driver. By early 1945, the war was lost. Soviet forces were advancing toward Berlin from the east. American and British armies were crossing the Rhine in the west. German cities were being reduced to rubble. And Adolf Hitler, the man who had promised a 1,000-year Reich, retreated into a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery and refused to leave. Kempka followed him down. The Führerbunker was a claustrophobic labyrinth of concrete rooms, damp corridors, and recycled air. It was designed to withstand direct hits from heavy bombs, but it couldn't withstand the collapse of reality outside its walls. By mid-April, the bunker had become a tomb for the living. Hitler's birthday on April 20th was celebrated with forced optimism, but everyone knew the end was coming. Kempka's role in those final days was limited. There was nowhere left to drive. The streets of Berlin were battlefields. Soviet tanks were advancing block by block. The bunker's inhabitants were trapped. But Kempka remained because Hitler remained. He stayed not out of ideology, but out of a duty that had become reflexive. For 9 years, his job had been to be there. And so he was. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony. Kempka was not present. The next day, April 30th, Hitler retreated to his private quarters with his new wife. It was mid-afternoon. Kempka was in the bunker's lower levels when the shot rang out. The details of what happened next would become the most important testimony Erich Kempka ever gave. He claimed he was summoned shortly after Hitler's suicide. When he entered the Führer's suite, he saw 2 bodies. Hitler sat slumped on a sofa, a gunshot wound to his right temple, a pistol on the floor. Eva Braun lay beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning. The smell of bitter almonds filled the room. Kempka said he was ordered to bring gasoline. Hitler had left explicit instructions. His body was not to fall into Soviet hands. It was to be burned beyond recognition. Kempka claimed he retrieved 200 liters of fuel from the Reich Chancellery's dwindling reserves. He said he carried jerry cans up the bunker stairs, through the emergency exit, and into the garden where Soviet shells were landing every few minutes. According to Kempka's account, Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, and his adjutant, Otto Günsche, carried the bodies outside wrapped in blankets. They placed them in a shallow crater created by an earlier artillery strike. Kempka said he poured the gasoline over the corpses. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and several others stood nearby, watching. Someone, Kempka couldn't remember who, ignited the fuel. The bodies went up in flames. Kempka claimed he watched the fire for several minutes before retreating back into the bunker. The heat was intense. The smoke was black and thick. He said he could see Hitler's face melting before he turned away. It was, he would later say, the most horrible thing he had ever witnessed. But even in that moment, there were inconsistencies. Other witnesses gave different accounts. Some said Kempka wasn't present at all during the burning. Others said he brought the gasoline but didn't pour it. Still, others claimed the fire was started differently, with grenades or by a torch fashioned from cloth. The chaos of the bunker's final hours made certainty impossible. What is certain is that within hours, the bunker was emptying. Hitler was dead. There was no reason to stay. Small groups began attempting to break through Soviet lines and escape Berlin. Kempka decided to leave with one of these groups. He had no plan, no destination. He simply knew he couldn't remain. On the night of May 1st, Kempka joined a breakout attempt led by Wilhelm Mohnke, the commandant of the Reich Chancellery. The group included Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's physician, and several others. They moved through the U-Bahn tunnels beneath Berlin, trying to avoid Soviet patrols. The tunnels were flooded in places, corpse-choked in others. The city above was burning. Near the Weidendammer Bridge, the group attempted to cross the Spree River under cover of darkness. Soviet machine gun fire tore through them. Kempka claimed he saw Martin Bormann struck by shrapnel and killed. He said he watched Bormann's body fall and made no attempt to retrieve it. This claim would later become controversial. Bormann's fate remained one of the great mysteries of the post-war period, and Kempka's testimony was used both to support and refute various theories about his death. Kempka himself was wounded during the crossing. Shrapnel struck his legs and back. He collapsed on the far side of the river and was pulled into a cellar by civilians. For the next several days he hid in the ruins, barely conscious, as Berlin fell to the Red Army. Soviet troops occupied the city on May 2nd. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. Erich Kempka, Hitler's personal driver, had survived. But survival was not freedom. Kempka knew he was a wanted man. His face was known to Allied intelligence. His position in Hitler's inner circle made him a high-value target. For interrogation, he couldn't stay in Berlin. Over the following weeks, still recovering from his wounds, he made his way west, moving through Soviet-occupied territory, avoiding checkpoints, sleeping in forests and abandoned buildings. By early June, he reached the American zone. He considered surrendering, but hesitated. He had no papers, no proof of identity. If he revealed who he was, he would be arrested immediately. If he lied, he might blend into the vast sea of displaced persons flooding through Germany. He chose to lie. For several months, Kempka lived under a false name, working as a laborer on farms and construction sites. He kept his head down. He didn't speak about the war. But the net was closing. Allied intelligence agencies were systematically hunting down former Nazi officials. Witness lists were being compiled. Kempka's name was on all of them. In early 1946, he was identified and arrested by American forces. He was taken to an interrogation center and questioned extensively. At first, he denied his identity. Then, when confronted with evidence, He admitted who he was. He confirmed he had been Hitler's driver. He confirmed he had been in the bunker. And then, over the course of dozens of interviews, he told his story. American and British intelligence officers were desperate for information about Hitler's death. Soviet authorities had found remains in the Reich Chancellery garden that they claimed were Hitler's, but they refused to share details with their Western allies. Rumors were spreading that Hitler had escaped, that he was in Argentina or Spain, or hiding in a U-boat base in Antarctica. The lack of confirmed remains fueled conspiracy theories. Kempka's testimony was crucial. He described the suicide in detail, the gunshot, the smell of cyanide, the orders to burn the bodies. He drew diagrams of the bunker layout. He identified other witnesses who might still be alive. He answered questions about Hitler's mental state in the final days, his physical health, his interactions with staff. And he insisted repeatedly that Hitler was dead, that he had seen the body, that there was no escape. But investigators noticed problems. Kempka's account contradicted other testimony in small but significant ways. The timing didn't always match. The sequence of events shifted between interviews. He seemed certain about some details and vague about others. When pressed, he became defensive. He claimed the chaos of the bunker made precise memory impossible. And perhaps it did. Or perhaps he was lying. Despite the inconsistencies, Kempka was not charged with war crimes. He had not been involved in military operations. He had not participated in atrocities. His role had been purely administrative, if such a word can be used to describe serving Hitler's personal needs. He was classified as a witness, not a perpetrator. After 2 years of detention and interrogation, he was released in 1948. Kempka returned to civilian life in West Germany. He married, had children, and worked in sales and business. He avoided publicity. For years, he gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, attended no reunions of former Nazi officials. He seemed content to disappear into the anonymity of post-war Germany, where millions of former party members were doing the same. But in 1951, something changed. Soviet authorities announced they had conclusive proof of Hitler's death. They released autopsy reports and photographs of dental remains that matched Hitler's records. Western intelligence agencies confirmed the findings. The conspiracy theories didn't vanish, but they lost much of their credibility. And Kempka, sensing an opportunity, decided to speak. He began giving interviews to journalists and historians. He wrote articles for German magazines. He presented himself as a first-hand witness to history, a man who had been there when the Third Reich ended. His accounts were vivid, filled with dramatic details, and they sold well. Readers were fascinated by the inner workings of Hitler's household, the mundane routines that existed alongside genocide. In 1956, Kempka published a memoir titled I Burned Hitler. The book was a commercial success. It recounted his years as Hitler's driver, his experiences in the bunker, and his escape from Berlin. Critics noted that the narrative was suspiciously polished for a man recalling traumatic events under extreme stress. Some details seemed embellished, others seemed convenient. But the book found an audience hungry for insider perspectives on the Nazi regime. The publication brought scrutiny. Historians began comparing Kempka's memoir to testimony from other bunker survivors. Otto Günsche, Hitler's adjutant, had also been captured and interrogated extensively by Soviet authorities. His account of Hitler's death was similar to Kempka's, but not identical. He said Kempka brought gasoline, but wasn't present during the actual burning. Ruckus Misch, a telephone operator in the bunker, gave yet another version, claiming he saw Kempka in the corridor after the suicide, but couldn't confirm his role in the disposal of the bodies. The contradictions didn't necessarily mean Kempka was lying. Memory is unreliable, especially under trauma. Different witnesses see different things. But Kempka's later interviews introduced new details that hadn't appeared in his earlier testimony. He began describing conversations he claimed to have had with Hitler that no one else mentioned. He recounted private moments that seemed designed to make him appear closer to the Führer than he likely was. By the 1960s, some historians were treating Kempka's testimony with skepticism. His credibility was questioned not because his core story was false, but because the embellishments made it difficult to separate fact from self-aggrandizement. He had been there. He had witnessed history. But how much of what he claimed to remember was real, and how much was constructed to serve his post-war identity as an important witness? Kempka continued giving interviews into the 1970s and 80s. He appeared in documentaries. He consulted on films about Hitler's final days. He attended historical conferences, always positioning himself as the man who knew what really happened. He never expressed remorse for his service to Hitler. He never acknowledged the moral weight of having enabled a dictator's daily life. When asked, he would say he was just a driver, just doing his job. Erich Kempka died on January 24, 1975, in Freiburg am Neckar, West Germany. He was 64 years old. His death was noted briefly in newspapers, remembered primarily as the passing of a historical footnote. There were no major obituaries, no outpouring of public reflection. He had outlived his moment of significance by 30 years. But his testimony remains. It's cited in nearly every historical account of Hitler's death. It's used in documentaries, books, and academic papers. And it's always used with a caveat. Kempka was there. Kempka saw things others didn't, but Kempka also had reasons to shape the narrative in ways that served his interests. So what do historians make of Erich Kempka today? The consensus is cautious. His core account of Hitler's suicide and the burning of the bodies is generally accepted as accurate. Too many other witnesses corroborated the basic facts for it to be entirely fabricated. But the details, the dramatic flourishes, the private conversations, the moments of intimacy with Hitler, those are treated with suspicion. Kempka was not a historian. He was not trained to observe and record with precision. He was a man whose entire adult identity was built around proximity to power. When that power collapsed, he had only one thing left to trade: his memories. And like anyone in that position, he had an incentive to make those memories as compelling as possible. The question of whether Kempka actually poured the gasoline that burned Hitler's body may never be definitively answered. He said he did. Others said he brought the gasoline but didn't pour it. Still others said he wasn't present. In the end, it may not matter. Someone poured the gasoline. Someone lit the fire. Hitler's body burned. The Third Reich ended. And Erich Kempka, whether he held the match or merely stood nearby, was there to witness it. What remains unsettling is not the uncertainty about Kempka's exact role, but what his life reveals about the nature of complicity. He was not a war criminal in the legal sense. He didn't pull a trigger. He didn't operate a gas chamber. He didn't issue orders that sent millions to their deaths. He drove a car. He maintained vehicles. He followed instructions. And for 9 years, that was enough to place him at the absolute center of one of history's greatest crimes. After the war, he lived quietly. He raised a family. He worked ordinary jobs. He became a salesman, a businessman, a man who blended into the fabric of post-war German society. Millions of others did the same. The vast machinery of the Nazi state had required vast numbers of people to function. Most of them were not ideologues. Most of them were not sadists. They were clerks, drivers, cooks, secretaries, mechanics. They did their jobs. And then, when it was over, they went home. Kempka's willingness to speak about his experiences set him apart from many of his peers, who chose silence. Whether he spoke out of a sense of historical duty or a desire for attention is impossible to know. Perhaps it was both. He was proud of having been trusted by Hitler. He was proud of his competence, and he seemed unable or unwilling to confront the moral implications of that pride. In his interviews, Kempka often spoke about Hitler in terms that were disturbingly neutral. He described him as demanding but fair, as charismatic but distant, as a man with quirks and preferences, likes and dislikes. He humanized Hitler not out of sympathy, but out of habit. For nearly a decade, Hitler had been his employer, his responsibility, the center of his professional life. That relationship, however monstrous its context, was real to him. And perhaps that's the most disturbing thing about Erich Kempka's story. He wasn't a monster. He was ordinary. He was a skilled worker who found a position of trust and held it. He was loyal, competent, and discreet. In another time, in another place, those qualities would have made him an admirable employee. But in the Third Reich, they made him complicit in evil. The historical record will always struggle with men like Kempka. They don't fit neatly into the categories we use to understand the Nazi regime. They weren't victims, they weren't resistors, but they also weren't the architects of genocide. They existed in the vast gray space between active participation and passive observation, doing jobs that were necessary for the regime to function, but not directly murderous. Kempka spent his final years in relative obscurity. He gave his last interview in 1974, less than a year before his death. He was asked if he had any regrets. He said he regretted that Germany had lost the war. He regretted that his career had been cut short. He regretted the suffering of the German people. He did not regret serving Hitler. He did not express horror at what the regime had done. He simply said he had done his job to the best of his ability, and that was all anyone could ask of him. The interviewer pressed him, asked if he felt any responsibility for enabling a dictator. Kempka became irritated. He insisted he was just a driver, that he had no influence over policy, that he couldn't have stopped what happened even if he'd wanted to. And perhaps that was true. But it was also an evasion, because every person who kept the machinery running, who made Hitler's life comfortable, who ensured his orders were carried out efficiently, bore some measure of responsibility for what that machinery produced. Today, more than 70 years after Hitler's death, Erich Kempka is remembered primarily through his testimony. His memoir is out of print. His interviews are archived in historical collections. His name appears in footnotes and bibliographies, always accompanied by that caveat: useful but unreliable, corroborated but contested. The broader truth about Kempka is that he represents something far larger than himself. He represents the thousands of people who made the Third Reich possible, not through enthusiasm for its ideology, but through simple competence. They showed up. They did their jobs. They didn't ask questions. And when it was over, they told themselves they had no choice. But they did have choices. Every day, in small ways, they chose to continue. They chose not to sabotage. They chose not to slow down. They chose not to resist. And those choices, accumulated across millions of individuals, allowed a regime built on hatred to function with terrifying efficiency. Erich Kempka drove Hitler to rallies where he spoke of racial purity and conquest. He drove him to meetings where the final solution was planned. He drove him to military headquarters where strategies for total war were devised. And every time he started the engine, shifted into gear, and pressed the accelerator, he was participating in something larger than transportation. He was enabling the mundane movements of a man whose orders would kill tens of millions. In the end, Erich Kempka's story is not just about one man's proximity to evil. It's about the nature of complicity itself, about how ordinary people enable extraordinary crimes, about how competence can be divorced from morality, and about how, when the reckoning comes, the men who kept the engine running will insist they were just drivers, going where they were told, doing what they were paid to do. But history remembers differently. History remembers that someone had to drive the car. Someone had to pour the gasoline. Someone had to stand and watch as the bodies burned. And that someone was Erich Kempka, a man who spent 9 years at the right hand of absolute evil and the rest of his life trying to convince the world he had only been following the road. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.